The automatic doors hissed open that morning, and the entire hospital froze. No one expected a battered German shepherd to appear in the rain, dragging a sick little girl behind him. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He just waited. Eyes full of purpose, like he knew this child had no one else. What they didn't know was that this dog wasn't a stray. He was her only family, and he'd crossed a nightmare to bring her here. Some bonds aren't built, they're chosen. If you believe in the power of loyalty, tell us where you're watching from. The automatic doors parted with a hiss. It wasn't a patient. It wasn't a nurse. It wasn't even human. It was a German shepherd soaked in rain, mud streaking his flanks, his ribs visible under matted fur. But what froze everyone wasn't his condition. It was what he was dragging, a child. Tiny girl, no older than 5. Wrapped in a torn blue blanket, barely breathing, her lips the color of frost. Her limbs didn't move. Her hair was stuck to her face with mud and dried blood. And the dog, he didn't bark or pace. He just stood still, eyes locked onto the nurses behind the counter, like he was waiting for someone to do their job. That Nurse Allison Keene was the first to break the silence. "My God. Someone get a crash cart," she shouted, already sprinting forward. The shepherd didn't flinch as people rushed toward him. He stepped back once, just one careful step, and then gently nudged the girl's shoulder with his snout, as if to say, "Help her." Now orderlies lifted the girl onto a gurney. Her skin was ice. Her fingers were blue. One of the paramedics whispered, "Hypothermic. She shouldn't even be alive." But she was, somehow. Allison turned to the dog. He stood there, soaked, unmoving, staring through the chaos like none of it mattered unless that little girl survived. His golden brown eyes weren't wild. They were focused, intelligent, haunted. "Does he belong to her?" someone asked. "Maybe," Allison replied, crouching down. "But that's not a stray. Look at his eyes." He knew exactly where to bring her. They tried to coax him away. He wouldn't leave. Not until the girl vanished behind the ER doors. Then, and only then, he collapsed by the waiting room wall, panting, too exhausted to fight anymore. Detective Kyle Mercer showed up 20 minutes later. Allison met him in the hallway, hands still shaking. "You're not going to believe this one," she said. The dog brought her in, dragged her right through the front doors. Kyle was no stranger to strange. He'd seen people come in handcuffed, bleeding, overdosing. But a dog delivering a nearly dead girl? He stared at the shepherd lying in the hallway. Where is she now? In IQ, still unconscious. No ID, no match in the system. But the dog, he won't move. The shepherd lifted his head slowly, eyes connecting with Kyle's. The detective crouched beside him, studying the faded tags around his neck. One was blank, the other scorched on the edges. The name barely legible, Sable. Kyle took a breath. That name, it scratched at something. A cold case. A file buried in an old cabinet. A facility. A whisper. He stood up. "We need to run his chip." In the ICU, Harper's chest rose and fell in slow, shallow movements. Dr. Mason Blake studied her chart, jaw tight. The dog dragged her at least a mile. No shoes, malnourished. Her vitals are barely holding. If she makes it through the night, it'll be a miracle. But in the waiting room, Sable stirred. As if he already knew she would. The machines beeped. Softly in the ICU, each one a small defiance against the silence that had wrapped around Harper's hospital room. Sunlight began to filter through the window blinds, drawing thin gold lines across her small, pale face. Her skin was still cold. Her breaths, though more regular now, came in shallow rises, like a child trying to sleep through a storm. Beside her, Nurse Allison stood quiet, arms crossed over her chest, eyes flicking between the monitors and the girl's unmoving body. But her gaze kept returning to the German shepherd lying just outside the glass doors. He hadn't budged all night. Sable was still caked in dried mud and rain, his ribs pressing against his fur like old battle scars. But he didn't look tired. He looked watchful, like he was guarding a flame that had almost gone out. Every time Harper's monitor spiked or dipped, his ears would twitch. Not in panic, just precision, like he knew her better than the machines ever could. Allison had tried to get him to move, had tried coaxing him with food, with soft voices, even with a clean towel. But the dog never responded. His loyalty wasn't to the hospital. It was to the child inside. When Harper stirred, was so faint Allison almost missed it. A flicker of fingers, a flutter under the eyelids, and then her lips moved, dry and cracked, barely shaping the words. "Where is he?" The nurse leaned in, heart racing. "Who, sweetheart?" But the child's eyes were already searching, glancing toward the door like a compass needle. Sable rose to his feet slowly, the stiffness in his limbs obvious, but his determination unwavering. The moment Harper's eyes met his, her fingers uncurled. "Sabi," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse but certain. "He found me." Allison's breath caught. There were no records for this girl. No ID, no fingerprints, no listing in the missing persons database. No name, just Harper. That's what she kept calling herself. That's what the dog responded to. And the way he moved to. Her bedside silent, reverent, his snout brushing gently against her tiny shoulder. It wasn't just familiarity. It was family. Detective Kyle Mercer watched from the hallway, arms folded, the hospital light casting sharp shadows across his face. The dog's chip had returned something strange, something he hadn't expected. No owner name. No vet registry. Just a long-defunct military code, linked to a classified program called Helix 47. The chip wasn't old. It had been activated just 2 years ago, but the facility it pointed to, shut down. Scrubbed from the system. It raised more questions than answers. He stepped into the room quietly. Harper glanced at him, eyes wide, not with fear but weariness, like she'd seen men like him before. "Can I ask you something, Harper?" he said gently. She didn't speak. She only looked down at Sable, who remained motionless at her side. "Do you remember where you came from? Any names, any places?" Harper shook her head, slow and small. Then, after a pause, she touched the scar on her neck. They used collars. The beep hurt. Kyle crouched lower. "Who used them?" Her voice trembled. "The ones behind the glass. They watched us sleep." "Me and Sabi." Dr. Blake, standing behind Kyle, stiffened. "Watched you sleep? They said I was learning," she murmured. "They said we were sinking." Her fingers curled into Sable's fur. "But it felt like disappearing." The room fell quiet. Even the monitors seemed to hush. Outside the hospital, the sky darkened with the weight of something approaching. Kyle stepped back and looked down at Sable again. The dog's eyes met his, not aggressive, not scared. Just waiting, calculating, and somehow human. Later that night, as Harper slept and Sable stood watch, Kyle sat in his unmarked cruiser, with a government tablet open in his lap. He searched the term Helix 47 again. This time, he dug deeper. Beyond the digital curtain. Beyond the redacted lines, he found it. A classified experiment. Neural linking. Emotional feedback training between young subjects and genetically selected canines. Designed for warfare. Tested in secret. Terminated allegedly after instability. Kyle looked back up toward the hospital window where Sable's shadow still lingered beside Harper's. If they were part of that experiment, then someone out there would be desperate to get them back, and someone else might already be on the way. Detective Kyle Mercer stood alone in the hospital's underground parking garage, the hum of overhead lights buzzing above his head like mosquitoes. Circling a wound. The printout he held trembled slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what it implied. Helix 47 wasn't just some military experiment gone wrong. It had been erased, covered over. Someone had deliberately scrubbed entire databases, medical logs, and personnel records. No closure reports. No whistleblower testimony. No survivors, except two: Harper and the dog called Sable. He looked up toward the elevator that would take him back to the ICU. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Even his contacts at the bureau had danced around the subject like it was radioactive. Drop it, they told him. Let the girl go into the system. Let the dog be euthanized. It's not worth the noise. But that dog had dragged a half-dead child through the rain to the hospital's front doors. That wasn't noise. That was purpose. Upstairs, Harper had fallen back asleep. But it wasn't a peaceful kind of rest. She twitched occasionally, whispering words that made no sense, strings of numbers, color codes, voices with no names. Allison had started keeping notes, not for medical charts. For something deeper, something unsettling. The girl didn't speak. Like a child raised in a home. She spoke like someone trained. And the dog. The way he mirrored her movements. The way his eyes snapped toward the monitor a full 2 seconds before her vitals changed. It was like he felt her pain. Anticipated it. Absorbed it. Dr. Blake had watched it happen twice now. Harper's oxygen levels would dip, and Sable would lift his head seconds before the alarm even blinked. He wasn't reacting. He was linked. In the staff lounge, Kyle spread out everything he had on the table. A few printed records, a blurry satellite photo of the now abandoned facility deep in the forests of eastern Oregon, and a short list of employees, all of them unreachable. Except one. Dr. Ezra Lynn, a cognitive neurologist and animal behavioralist who disappeared just before the project was terminated. No known address, no employment history since. But Kyle had found something. Utility bill, paid 6 months ago, from a cabin 20 miles from the former Helix site. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He was already dialing when his phone vibrated with a new alert. He froze. It was from the hospital security system. Motion detected. IQ hallway. Kyle sprinted down the corridor just in time to see Sable push the emergency door open with his paw, something most dogs wouldn't even think to do. He moved with determination, as if drawn by something beyond sound or scent. Kyle followed him through the hallway, down a staircase, past confused orderlies and a janitor frozen in place. Sable reached the staff library and stopped cold nose. Pressed to the glass of a locked office. Inside, Harper was sitting upright in a rolling chair, barefoot, pale, wearing a hospital gown too big for her frame. She was clutching something in her hand, a photograph. Where she'd gotten it, no one knew. But Kyle did. He recognized the man in the image. Dr. Ezra Lynn. Harper looked up slowly, her eyes glassy. He told me not to be afraid, she said softly. He said Sabi would remember the way out. Allison rushed in behind them, out of breath. How did she even get in here? Harper turned her head. He's coming. The man with the scar. He wants Sabi back. He wants me gone. Kyle stepped forward. What man? What scar? She didn't answer. She simply reached down and touched Sable's collar, the burnt tag still clinging to its chain. He told me if I ever got free, to find the lights. What lights? Harper's voice was calm. Too calm. The lights that don't blink. Kyle froze. That phrase, it had been in the Helix documents, a trigger phrase. A memory marker. He crouched next to her. Harper, you said the man with the scar is coming? She nodded, resting her head on Sable's side. He doesn't like when dogs remember. Outside, far in the distance, a black SUV rolled past the hospital entrance. It didn't stop, but it circled the block. Twice. The air in the hospital turned heavier that evening, though no one could quite say why. The fluorescent lights buzzed a little louder. The nurses spoke a little softer. And Sable didn't move from his spot beside Harper's bed. His eyes remained locked on the door, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Harper, too, had grown quieter. Her shoulders curled inward, and the soft mumblings that used to escape her lips had gone still. It was like a shadow had passed over her, and only she and the dog could see it. Downstairs, Kyle Mercer watched the security footage for the third time. The black SUV wasn't just casing the block. It had paused twice, once at the ambulance bay, once outside the children's wing. No plates, tinted windows. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a town like this unless it meant to disappear. He knew the pattern: surveillance, testing response times, clocking exits. He walked into the hospital's front office and pulled Nurse Allison aside. "I want security doubled at the girl's door," he said. "No one goes in or out unless I clear it. Not even medical." Allison didn't argue. The fear in Kyle's voice was enough. Harper hadn't spoken much since she mentioned the man with the scar. But that night, as the wind pressed against the windows and the hospital floor creaked like a warning, she opened her eyes and whispered one word: "Run." Sable rose instantly. His ears locked toward the hallway, and a low growl built in his chest. Not fear, recognition. Then came the sound. Soft, metallic, like a knife brushing a wall. A click, a footstep. Kyle burst into the room seconds later, gun drawn, his voice sharp. "Stay behind me." But it was Sable who moved first. He charged past Kyle, down the corridor, paused silent on the tile floor. Kyle followed, gun raised. At the far end of the hallway, the emergency exit stood slightly open. The air that crept through it was cold and wet, like breath from something buried. Sable didn't hesitate. He pushed through the door and out into Q. The parking lot was empty. At least it looked that way. Then Kyle saw him, a man standing beneath the floodlights near the ambulance bay. Tall, coat heavy with rain, a flat-brimmed hat casting a long shadow across his face. He turned slightly, just enough for Kyle to see it. The scar, running from the corner of his mouth to just under his ear. Clean, precise, surgical. The man looked down at Sable with something between disdain and familiarity. "You remember, don't you?" he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Even after all that time." Kyle stepped beside Sable. "You need to back away now." The man didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly. He was designed to remember. That's what made him special. "What do you want with the girl?" The scarred man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She doesn't belong in your world. She was made for ours. And the longer she stays with that dog, the more dangerous it becomes. You're not protecting her. You're delaying the inevitable." Kyle's grip on his weapon tightened. "She's a child." "No," the man said flatly. "She's a mirror. And if you knew what's been written into her, you'd be the one running." Sable stepped forward then, no growl, no bark, just the silent threat of a dog who'd been trained not just to bite, but to finish. The man didn't flinch. "He won't attack me," he said. "He still remembers my voice." Kyle's finger tensed on the trigger. "Try me." The standoff lasted 5 seconds. Then the man turned. He walked to the SUV, climbed in, and drove off without a word. Sable didn't chase him. He just stared at the taillights until they vanished down the road, his body trembling, not from fear, but from restraint. Back upstairs, Harper had curled beneath the blankets, shivering. When Sable returned to her room, she let out a sigh and reached for his fur like it was the only safe thing left in the world. "He found us," she said. "He'll come again." Kyle stood by the window, watching the road where the SUV disappeared. "Yes," he whispered, "but so will we." They left the hospital before dawn, before the staff could question the missing forms or Kyle's unmarked vehicle idling in the service lot. Harper clutched a small bundle of blankets in the back seat, curled against Sable's warm body, while the city lights faded behind them like stars blinking out one by one. Kyle drove with both hands locked to the wheel, eyes flicking constantly. To the mirror. They had a head start, but not much of one. No one said the word safe. It would have felt like tempting fate. The child didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. Sable already knew. He sat upright beside her, gaze steady on the road ahead, body stiff with something more than alertness. It was memory. Muscle-deep memory. And as they left the city and wound into Oregon's thick forest roads, the air around the dog began to change. His breathing slowed. His tail stopped moving. His eyes, they darkened. Not out of fear but recognition. 30 miles later, they reached the edge of a clearing where the map ended. Nothing marked the property, no gate, no mailbox, no signal. Only a winding trail barely wide enough for the Jeep. Trees leaned over the path like they wanted to keep secrets buried. Harper stirred awake as Kyle killed the engine. She looked out the window and whispered, "He hated this place." Kyle followed her gaze. Ahead stood the remains of a large, low-building concrete walls overrun with moss. Steel shutters half-rusted open, vines strangling broken security cameras. The roof had collapsed in places, exposing skeletal beams and gaping holes that leaked sky. But the worst part wasn't what they saw. It was what Sable did. He refused to get out of the car. He stayed frozen, staring at the building. His muscles locked in place, his ears pulled flat. When Harper opened the door and stepped out, Sable followed, but slowly, each paw step deliberate, as if crossing a graveyard. Kyle noticed the shift. The dog who had charged into danger without flinching was now moving like something might reach out and pull him back into the past. They entered through a side door, half-hinged and hanging askew. The air inside was stale with mold, old chemicals, and something else, something clinical. The remains of lab tables, collapsed cages, and shattered monitor screens littered the floors. In one corner, a wall still bore the ghost of a logo. Helix 47 faded, scratched out, but still visible beneath the grime. Harper walked ahead, barefoot on the cracked tiles, her hospital gown fluttering like a ghost's shadow. "It's still here," she murmured. "The lights don't blink anymore. But it's still here." Kyle turned to her gently. "You were kept here?" She nodded. "Me and the others. Some could talk. Some only screamed. They told us the dogs were just machines, but we knew better." Sable sniffed the air. Then he growled low, deep, guttural. Kyle followed his gaze toward a corridor leading underground. The dog moved first this time, slowly at first, then faster. Down the steps, past the flickering remains of emergency lights, and into a room that made Harper freeze. Dozens of cages lined the walls, small and square, built into the metal. Names had been scratched into each one. Some were just numbers. Others had bloodied initials. One door hung open, and Harper walked to it like she was sleepwalking. "This was his," she whispered. Sable stepped beside her and lowered his head. The collar was still inside, black leather, burned at the edges, with two metal prongs meant to punish movement. Kyle crouched and touched the edge of the padlocked cage door. His fingers came away with something sticky. "Not blood. Grease. Fresh. Someone's been here," he muttered. "Recently." Harper knelt beside a shattered monitor. "This was where they watched us dream," she said. "They said if we bonded hard enough, they could see what we saw." Sable let out a whine then. Not from pain but grief. Kyle turned. The dog had walked toward another cage, one Harper hadn't noticed. Inside it lay the decayed remains of a small dog, curled tightly in on itself. The tag read, Unit Delta 7, Companion. Harper. Harper collapsed to her knees. "They said she failed. That I had to forget her." She touched Sable's side. "But you didn't let me." Kyle stood, breath cold in his lungs. "They didn't just train you here," he said. "They erased you here." And as thunder rumbled above the collapsing roof, Sable turned his head slowly toward the stairwell. Someone else had just entered the building. The silence broke like glass. It started with the creak of rusted metal somewhere above. Slow and deliberate. Not wind, not animal. A footstep, then another. Harper's breath caught in her throat. Kyle raised his hand instinctively, signaling for stillness, and stepped in front of the child. Sable had already moved into a low stance, placing himself between both of them and the echoing noise. His body was rigid, but his growl was restrained, as if he knew sound might cost them more than time. Kyle pointed toward the shadows behind a collapsed server rack. Harper ducked behind it silently, her knees shaking beneath her. Sable stayed just inches from her shoulder. His breathing was slow and deep, but his ears were locked forward like antennae tuned to danger. The sound moved. Down the stairwell. Through the corridor. Whoever was coming didn't need to hide. They weren't afraid. Kyle edged closer to the hallway entrance, weapon drawn, every muscle tensed. And then finally a voice echoed softly through the chamber. "You came back," the man said. "I always knew you would." The words were addressed to the dark, but Kyle knew they weren't for him. Sable responded instantly. His growl deepened into a long rumbling moan. Pain, recognition, rage. The scarred man stepped into view, dressed in a long gray coat, damp from rain, boots clicking against the concrete like gunshots. His face was calm, but there was something detached in his eyes, like he'd seen too much and felt too little. "You never understood, did you?" he said, staring directly at the dog. "You weren't supposed to form attachments. That wasn't the point." Sable barked once, sharp, deep, guttural. It echoed like thunder in the underground walls. The man didn't flinch. Kyle stepped between them. "You've got 5 seconds to leave." The scarred man tilted his head, almost amused. "And deprive you of the truth? Detective, you've walked into a burial ground, and the corpses here aren't just the ones you can smell." He turned his attention to Harper's hiding place. "She remembers, doesn't she? More than you think." Harper stepped out, trembling, her hand on Sable's back. "You said she was a failed subject," Kyle growled. "She was," the man replied, "until he bonded with her." He nodded at Sable, his expression almost reverent now. "We tested them all. Ran hundreds of trials. Fear response, empathy sync, command hierarchy. But this dog, he broke the program. Every time they tried to separate him from her, he shut down. Refused to eat, refused to attack. He chose loyalty over obedience." Harper's voice came out small but certain. "Because I didn't leave him." "And he didn't leave you?" The man replied softly. "Not when we locked him in isolation. Not when we wiped your memory. Not even when we burned the compound and moved on." Kyle's grip on his gun tightened. "You abandoned them." "We archived them," the man corrected coldly. "They were anomalies, useful but unstable." "And you," he said, pointing at Harper, "were supposed to forget. That was the mercy we gave you." Sable stepped forward now, low and slow. The man's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't," Kyle warned. But the scarred man smiled again, this time without warmth. "You think this ends with me? I'm just the last one who remembered what we did here. There are others. Some still running. Experiments, some who never stopped." Kyle lowered his weapon slightly. "So why come back?" "Because I thought I buried him," the man said, eyes locked with Sable's. "And here he is still guarding the child he was programmed to forget." Then, unexpectedly, the scarred man tossed something to the ground, a small data drive, enclosed in weather-worn casing. It slid across the concrete and stopped near Kyle's feet. "That's your proof," he said. "Everything. The files, the names, the other dogs. But you should ask yourself, if they went through this much for one prototype pair, how far? Do you think they went with the rest?" Before Kyle could respond, the man turned and disappeared back up the corridor. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply walked away like a man finished with ghosts. Kyle picked up the drive and stared at it in his hand. Cold, heavy, loaded with answers. Behind him, Harper slumped against Sable, her body tired, her voice barely audible. "We weren't supposed to be real," she whispered. Sable pressed his head into her chest, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, he let out a soft whimpering cry. Not fear, not pain. Grief. For all the dogs that hadn't made it out. Rain tapped against the motel room window like a ticking clock. Harper sat on the floor, her knees hugged tight to her chest, the flickering light from the television casting soft shadows across her pale skin. She hadn't spoken since they left the facility, not about the cages, not about the man with the scar, and not about the dog's low, broken cry that haunted the Jeep all the way back. Sable lay curled beside her, his body pressed tightly against hers like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go. Kyle sat at the room's small desk, the data drive connected to his encrypted laptop. The files inside were unindexed deliberately, scrambled with useless metadata and false file names, but he'd seen this kind of cover-up before. Military contractors, black-funded labs, operations that only existed because someone paid a fortune to make them disappear. There were video logs, hundreds of them. Most were grainy surveillance tapes showing children in cold, white rooms, some with dogs, some without. Some children were screaming, others sat in eerie silence, eyes blank. And in every file number, there was a lettered suffix D for dog, C for child, and X for retired. Kyle didn't need a key to decode that one. Harper turned to face him slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They never used our names, just numbers." Kyle looked up. "Do you remember yours?" She nodded. C18. Sabi was D18. They said we were a matched pair, like a lock and a key. Sable lifted his head, as if hearing the number stirred something in him too. Kyle tapped the keyboard again, pulling up the entries tied to 18. There were log scans of biometric readings, cortisol spikes, neurological activity charts. But one file caught his eye, a short clip labeled simply Event. D18 Override. He opened it. The video was low resolution, but clear enough to make Kyle sit up straighter. It showed Harper thinner, younger, strapped to a gurney in a sterile room. Around her, men in lab coats adjusted monitors. She was sobbing. Not screaming, just crying. And on the far side of the room, Sable sat inside a containment cage. He didn't move. He didn't bark. Until she called his name. "Sabi, please." The moment her voice broke, the dog exploded. He rammed the steel bars of his cage, snarling, slamming his body again and again until blood spattered the walls. The scientists panicked. One reached for a tablet, trying to activate something. The collar around Sable's neck sparked, flashing red. He yelped, stumbled, then lunged again. The feed cut out. Kyle sat back, the silence in the room now suffocating. "They tried to separate us," Harper said, her voice hollow. "They wanted him to forget, but he wouldn't." Sable moved closer to her now, curling around her side protectively, and she buried her fingers in the thick fur along his neck. Kyle leaned forward again, navigating to the next file batch, this one titled Non-Returned Units. His eyes scanned the list. D03 lost during field trial, CO3 terminated. D12, subject destabilized. C12, unretrieved. D29 unknown. C-29, unknown. D47. Pending location, C47. Pending LOCATIO, and he counted 11 other matched pairs listed as unaccounted for. Some labeled rogue, others simply left blank. At the bottom of the page was a single line in red. Assets remain active. Retrieval protocols suspended until further notice. He turned to Harper. "There are more of you." Her lips parted slightly. "I dreamed of them sometimes, not their faces. Just the pain." Kyle's jaw clenched. "Then this isn't just about protecting you anymore. It's about finding the rest." Sable stood now, walking to the edge of the room and staring at the door. His tail didn't wag. His stance was still. "What is it, boy?" Kyle asked, but Harper already knew. She stood beside him and whispered, "He remembers." Kyle grabbed his gear. "Where?" Harper touched the window, staring into the pouring night. "Where they buried the ones who couldn't run." And Sable pressed his paw to the door, not in fear, but in promise. The road was narrow, barely more than a line between trees, and the rain didn't let up once. Kyle drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his sidearm. His jaw was tight, his eyes never straying far from the mirror. Harper sat behind him, wrapped in an old jacket that hung off her shoulders, her head leaning against Sable's flank. The dog hadn't slept, not since the motel. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, like he was guiding them somewhere, only he could see. They followed no map. Only instinct, and Sable had plenty of that. The location had once been marked as a training satellite station. Now it was just a scar in the forest-burned fencing, cracked concrete, and a tall Combs tower that loomed like a metal skeleton over the trees. Sable stepped out of the Jeep first. His posture shifted. Every hair on his back stood up. He sniffed the air once, then twice, then growled. "We're not alone," Kyle muttered. They moved quickly. The buildings were silent, but not empty. Inside the largest structure, they found the remnants of cages. Not like the ones before. These were open, torn, as if someone or something had already broken free. Harper clutched Sable's collar, her hand shaking. "They brought them here," she whispered. "The ones who didn't bond, they called them nulls." Kyle stepped further in, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the hall. The walls were scratched. Deep gouges, not from tools, but claws. Then came the sound. A low, bone-deep howl. Not a wolf. A dog in pain. Sable turned his head and bolted. Kyle and Harper followed, their feet pounding against damp concrete as they raced toward the eastern wing. The air changed there. It stank of iron, chemicals, and something else, something like grief, soaked into walls. They reached the door at the end of the corridor. Sable stopped short. His ears went flat. Kyle pushed it open. Inside were 3 dogs. German shepherds. Bigger than Sable. Scarred. Eyes wide. They didn't growl. They didn't charge. They just watched, waiting for orders. They no longer understood. One of them limped forward. Its collar still blinked red. Harper stepped beside Sable. "They didn't let them choose," she said. "They made them forget." The dogs looked at her. Something changed. Their breathing slowed. Their eyes dropped, not in submission, but in recognition. One let out a soft chuff, and Sable stepped toward him. Nose to nose, the connection was wordless, ancient. And then Harper whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Behind them, metal slammed. Footsteps. Shouting. Kyle pulled his weapon. The scarred man had returned, but he wasn't alone. 2 handlers with tranquilizers moved into the hall, their gear marked with a new insignia: private security, Black Ops. No government logo in sight. "This doesn't concern you," the man barked. "We're recovering assets." "They're not assets," Kyle growled. "They're survivors." "Wrong again." The man raised a small remote, the LED blinking. "This shuts them down, every last one." But Sable moved first. He charged. Jaws wide, eyes burning with purpose. The fight was fast, brutal. The handlers didn't stand a chance. Kyle took one down. Sable took the other. The scarred man raised the remote only to have it torn from his hand by a leaping shepherd, one of the rescued 3. The device clattered to the ground. Sparks burst. The light blinked once, then died. The dogs didn't. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, surrounding Harper like a wall of memory and muscle. The scarred man backed against the wall. "You don't understand," he rasped. "If they remember everything, they'll come apart. Their minds weren't made for freedom. Harper stepped forward, calm and clear-eyed. "No," she said. "They were made for control." But Sabi showed me what it feels like to be chosen. She looked at Sable. "I choose him." Kyle walked the man out of the building at gunpoint. The other dogs followed in silence. Not as prisoners, but as a pack. Days later, Harper sat in a sunlit backyard. No hospital walls. No metal collars. Just grass, wind, a quiet sky. Sable lay beside her, his head in her lap. Kyle brought her a tablet. "They decrypted the last file," he said. "There were 19 pairs. 13 are still out there, scattered, hidden. Some are probably still running." Harper looked up. "Can we find them?" Kyle smiled. "With Sable," he said. "Yeah, I think we can." The shepherd lifted his head. His eyes no longer carried weight. They carried hope.